how are we supposed to tell our kids that they matter when things like this happen to them?
I speak on behalf of the government of Saskatchewan when I say that we are committed to this dialogue going forward, as difficult as it may be at times.
The more people communicate, the more understanding there is for both sides.
If you pull it, you have to be prepared to use it. And I wouldn't be prepared to use it to defend property.
And there's concern about safety of your livestock and also of your property.
Stop blaming each other.
An unprecedented cry for justice reform came on the heels of the acquittal of Saskatchewan farmer Gerald Stanley in the shooting death of Cree man Colton Boushie. Politicians and activists weighed in, and intense emotions on all sides have exploded. Now it seems we've been led into a great divide. In the aftermath of the verdict, anger and tensions sowing distrust and creating false beliefs. You, our viewers, called us to go to North Battleford for some answers, and so we did. Molly Thomas brings us stories from a place in Canada that has race relations reeling. I'm Lorna Dueck.
I'm Sheldon Neal.
And I'm Molly Thomas in Battleford, Saskatchewan.
This is Context.
I don't think, in terms of the way the incident began or ended tragically, anyone took the time to make it a racial crime.
Saskatchewan farmers say we underestimate the fear they live in because of Aboriginal crime on their property. Regina broadcaster John Gormley has the pulse on farmers' views. Our Molly Thomas speaks with him in Saskatoon.
We have to respect one another. Otherwise, this is what we're teaching our kids.
Colton Boushie's uncle in Battleford says this is a turning point in Canada, and it's up to all of us, not only politicians, to find a new way forward.
Sometimes before good can happen, some things need to be upturned.
And Indigenous pastor Dolores Netmaker on the layers of pain in First Nations community. The only way to heal those wounds, she says, is through the Creator's grace. The word battle is not lost on us as we head now to Molly Thomas in search of reconciliation in northern Saskatchewan.
We are here in the Battlefords. This is an area that is surrounded by 6 First Nations, and Red Pheasant, of course, one of them, which is where Colton Boushie was from. That's a 30-minute drive south of this area. Now, we are on Treaty 6 territory. And remember, treaties were really covenants. They were agreements between the Indigenous people and the first white settlers to come together in peace and harmony and live in this land. And unfortunately, this trial has done nothing to help those treaties that we're both a part of. New numbers from the Angus Reid Institute show us how divided Canadians are around this case. 30% said that this verdict was good and fair. 32% of Canadians say no, it was wrong and it was flawed. And yet another 38% say they are completely unsure. When you look at the case of justice and jury reform, which was a big part of this conversation, 6 in 10 Canadians say that we need reform to our justice system, to our jury, the way that we pick juries. When you look in Saskatchewan, people say that verdict was right. It was wrong of the Trudeau government to get involved in this case and say anything, and that justice reform is not necessary. Now, part of the problem that you, our rural viewers, raised is that this is not a racism issue, but it's actually a rural crime issue. And you say that the RCMP is supposed to be your front line, and yet they're just not fast enough to respond to all the calls out there. So we contacted the RCMP. We asked them about response time specifically in the Battlefords area, and they say it's very difficult to give that information because you have to consider that each incident is very unique. The fact that there's geographical challenges across this province, that there are weather challenges, and you have to think about, what other calls might be coming at exactly the same time. What they can say is that reported property crimes are actually down 5% over the last few years. So if you look at 2016, those incidents were more than 41,000. In 2017, there were around 39,000 incidents. But still, despite these declines, Maclean's magazine calls this area the most dangerous place in the country. And many farmers that we've been talking to on the phone completely agree with that statement. And because of that, many feel threatened to share their stories, to speak out about their own concerns. And so we sat down with John Gormley, the province's most popular talk radio host. He was raised in Battleford with likely the largest rural listenership in Saskatchewan.
This has been a really difficult situation for all of Saskatchewan. I think farmers acknowledge there was a terrible loss. A young man lost his life. But beyond the criminal trial, there's been a lot of, I think, healthy discussion about how do we conduct trials, the presumption of innocence, the burden of the proof on the Crown to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. These are important issues, but deeper than that, in many, many regions of Saskatchewan, there are farmers who feel besieged, and there's been a big national or a big regional debate on RCMP access. You can have literally a life and death situation on a farm, and an RCMP cruiser going 140 kilometers an hour will take 30 to 50 minutes to be there.
Right, just even the geographical challenges of this province.
Even the geographic challenges. This is a vast province. So farmers in some areas have been preyed upon. They've had buildings torched, they've had vehicles stolen, they've had gasoline stolen, and it's not always an Indigenous issue, but sometimes close to some Indigenous communities, relations have broken down.
So do you think then that farmers have been misrepresented in mainstream media as the villains here?
Oh, absolutely they have. In fact, it was interesting, even in the Stanley case, it came out in the very early evidence, Stanley had a bunch of tires in one of his shops that he would often give or sell to people who came by with flat tires. Because if you're far enough in rural Saskatchewan, everybody knows the person who walks up to your yard and says, hey, I've got a problem. In this situation, it was far more complex than that, and the evidence itself showed it was far darker than that. There was a loaded firearm in the vehicle. Another farm, there'd been an attempted theft. There were so many things going on at the time of this SUV arriving in the Stanley yard that when Mr. Stanley testified, he felt, in his words, pure terror. An awful lot of farmers knew precisely what that meant.
Certain farmers have told me, this is not a racism issue, this is a rural crime issue, period. But does race actually play a factor here? I mean, is there a race problem in that Battleford area?
I don't think anyone took the time to make it a racial crime. So that's where I would deal with this issue.
You don't think, John, that if that car was full of 5 white kids, that it would be different?
In the context as the evidence came in, okay, let's remember, let's say 3 of the white kids lied 3 times.
Yeah.
They lied to the cops, they lied at the prelim, they lied at the trial. Then as you get out, and I don't mean to belabor this, somebody wearing a hoodie is rummaging through a vehicle, somebody else wearing a hoodie walks to your shop. You turn around, somebody else moves, your quad starts. Then the vehicle moves towards your son. All of this is happening in 90 seconds. I don't think anyone's saying, is the man under that hoodie who's running toward my shop Indigenous or non-Indigenous? So I respectfully push back on the evidence here a little bit against the Toronto narrative. Now, are there racial issues in rural Saskatchewan? You bet there are, and it's not a good thing.
How as neighbors from different communities, John, do we move forward in places like Saskatchewan, other rural parts of Canada? Because, I think of myself as a journalist. I've walked onto many farms in Saskatchewan, not knowing anyone, knocking on the door, trying to find a story, talk to farmers. I don't know if I feel comfortable doing that anymore.
I've walked onto farms in that exact scenario, and once you get past the dog and you let the people know that you're there because you're lost,
right,
they would bend over backwards.
But John, we're different colors, so us approaching that doorway is very different.
Absolutely, but I think a lot of it is, and an Indigenous guy phoned up and said, when you walk onto someone's farm and you're able to walk past the distrust and say, hey, I've got a problem, can you help me?
Sure.
Then good things start happening. If you come ripping onto the farmyard in that kind of context, as the evidence showed in this case, somebody's going to be very afraid. And when people are operating out of fear, they obviously aren't going to make the best choices.
John, you think that the Gerald Stanley verdict, this whole conversation is actually a backdrop to something that happened in the 90s that most people don't know about?
In northwestern Saskatchewan, in that area, when you say the names Teterenko and Kipp, Mr. Teterenko was a farmer all by himself. His friend Brian Kipp was visiting him one night. 2 men came onto the farm with a gun one of the men who was later convicted of manslaughter said, well, I was just along to steal gas. The man with the gun didn't want any witnesses and shot them execution style. When farmers live in that context in that area, this doesn't again mean it's ever right to shoot anybody. This doesn't indict people of red pheasant. But you can see the sensitivity when this is all happening. A farmer remembers the killing of Jerry Tedorenko and Brian Kipp. Even though it was nearly 25 years ago, that still causes a lot of fear in that area.
John, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure, thank you.
Well, if you think the reconciliation process is a mess, at least we're talking. The flashpoint of the Saskatchewan trial of Gerald Stanley and Colten Boushie's death moved from human tragedy to something very different, says Convivium editor Peter Stockland. He's a Westerner, longtime editor in the West, but he joins us today from Ottawa. Peter, you state this trial moved us from tragedy to an ideological category of settler and oppressed. Grief became rage, and so when our federal justice minister reacted to the verdict by tweeting, "Canada can do better," what effect does that have for justice?
Well, Lorna, at a very practical level, although the jury had delivered its verdict and exonerated Mr. Stanley, that was still a live trial. It is still a live trial. It was still open to appeal. The Crown has 30 days to launch an appeal. Now, whether they're going to, whether they would have, and obviously whether that appeal would have succeeded or not, those are open questions we will probably never know. A number of lawyers groups and independent lawyers by themselves have said, look, this was totally inappropriate. I don't think anybody objected to the expression of sympathy for the family. Obviously, as you say, it was a tragedy. But to make a political comment extended to both the family and by then to a political constituency while a trial is still live is just not appropriate. It should not be done.
Okay, so it is unclear here if the change of an all-white jury, or the charge that it's an all-white jury, is actually true, but the peremptory jury challenge gives the right of lawyers on both sides to reject jurors essentially just by looking at them. How does Canada's jury selection affect trial like this?
Well, as a matter of fact, Lorna, in 2015, the Supreme Court declared very, very, very clearly that this idea of seeking out some kind of mix and match representation on juries is not acceptable in Canadian law. It's not a part of Canadian law. What the state is obliged to do in a jury trial is canvass as broad as possible a section of the population so that it is a genuine jury of the accused peers. But the state is not obliged to pick two of these and three of those, or a couple of this different category. Mr. Justice Moldaver, in the decision, in that 2015 decision, was categorical that that would be a legal quagmire to get into and simply unheard of in our judicial and our jury selection system.
Okay, now it does seem, though, Mr. Stanley had an assumption of guiltiness in public perception instead of innocence. That should be a great concern to Canadians. How do we stop that from happening?
See, I think what happened in this trial, and it's happened elsewhere, is the importation of this idea that because there are systemic injustices in the broader society, that again, in this case, any finding, any verdict but guilty was systemic racism, systemically unacceptable. Well, it followed that through to its logical conclusion, and it leads you to the question asking, well, then why have a trial in the first place? If the only acceptable outcome was guilt, then you don't need to try anybody. You can just get a hat, put a piece of paper in it with one word written on it, and pick that piece of paper out of the hat. You don't need to go through the expense, the trouble, the trials of a jury trial. You just say, well, I'm sorry, systemically, you're guilty. And we all know from history where that leads. And when people let go of their either political ideas or the emotion of the moment, I think they can see pretty clearly where that leads.
All right, you've given us a lot to think about, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
That was Peter Stockland, publisher of Convivium magazine, senior writer at Cardis. He joined us from Ottawa. Indigenous pastor Dolores Netmakers talks about the courage required to genuinely heal in this country. Will we choose to graciously unwrap the layers of pain? That's just ahead.
Next week on Context, will North Korea play nice after they extended an olive branch at the Olympics, or will it continue to build its nuclear arsenal? As the U.S. turns up the sanctions, Context explores what the future may look like inside the infamous Hermit Kingdom.
We were making progress. These two trials have turned us 3 steps back. You know, it's like we got to start all over again. The media sensationalizes the extremes.
There's a big divide. You have to close that divide and start building bridges.
Whether it's, you know, white versus First Nations or First Nations versus white, both of them have to smile to one another. And for goodness sakes, strike up a conversation. There's lots to talk about.
Well, the people most affected in all of this are 2 families. The Bushis, living now with a dead son, nephew, and brother in tragic circumstances. And we cannot forget the Stanleys, who turned down our media request. Perhaps one day they will want to tell their story. But we go now to Molly Thomas in an interview with Colten Boushy's uncle, Alvin Baptiste, and their family's view.
I've been watching the conversations in Saskatchewan, mostly online. You know, not being here, I'm watching the reaction points from both Indigenous communities, and I'm watching them from white communities, and the rhetoric is scary. You see death threats sometimes. We're seeing, you know, musings of violence. I mean, we both have to live together on this land. How do we move forward after something like this?
When you look at this, who's doing the threats?
Seen it on both sides online.
That is because it's anger. It's anger on both sides, and in order for these young people, one thing I had suggested that we should have our own justice committee, our own courts.
Do you think that'll separate even more? You know, Canada, a diverse country, or do we need to, you know, reform what's already there? Either
that go in that direction, or bring our own justice system. And I think it would work. The judges, the prosecutors, the juries don't have or understand the First Nations people's way of life.
Alvin, do you see how there could be fear there? I mean, a car driving up onto land, even if they saw it coming, you know, intoxicated young people?
I tried to put myself in Gerald Stanley's shoes.
Mm-hmm.
How he must have to deal with First Nations people. The hatred. Mad. Numerous times my place has been broken in. I have lost tools. Things have been gone missing. Putting up with that. I'm going to do something about this. And if they come around my yard, then it's time to retaliate. What he has done is racial killing. And how he's honored and giving $250,000 for killing an Indigenous man, a young man, just 22 years old.
What would you need as an Indigenous person, obviously immediately affected by this case? What would you need to change to be comfortable being neighbors again?
Relationship. Communication. Understanding. If the community is having problems with our people, we want to hear it from their community and let us know that we will soon address this problem. That is one of the things we need to do, is start communicating. Stop blaming each other.
You spoke of that belief in Jesus. How is that helping you through?
I do believe in Jesus. I do believe in that he was among us, he walked among us. In my language, we call him Nutawi no Kusans, our Father's Son. He was another person, was condemned and killed for no reason.
The entire country knows the name Colten Boushie now. We know it from a story. We know it from this case. This was your nephew.
He was like my son. My kids, my sister's kids, are like my children.
If you could say anything to him, what would you want to say?
I would want to say that I loved you, Colten. What I would also tell him, go be with your relatives, your ancestors. Don't look back. Walk with God.
Thank you, Molly, for bringing us an important interview there, clearly showing the deep hurt, the remaining scars on Colten Boushie's family, and our shared spirituality.
Next week on Context, will North Korea play nice after they extended an olive branch at the Olympics, or will it continue to build its nuclear arsenal? As the U.S. turns up the sanctions, Context explores what the future may look like inside the infamous Hermit Kingdom.
As we wrap up today's program and hopefully move forward together on this subject, we head now for the last word from Indigenous Pastor Dolores Netmaker, who's with our Molly Thomas in Regina.
You know, I want to ask, this is a tense time in Canada. Mm-hmm. The racial divide between the white community and the Indigenous community has been all over the media. Mm-hmm. But yet, you say this is a time for God to be working within your people.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, I think one of the things, I do believe that we're living in very exciting times as Indigenous people. I've heard many words over our people, spoken over our people through the church, that God was going to be using our people. And that's something that I've held on to my heart for a long time. And now I feel like I'm seeing it. And sometimes before good can happen, some things need to be upturned. With everything that has been happening with our young people, you think about all the suicides that have happened, something that's close to my heart, with the things that have been happening with our youth. And so there's a root cause to all of that.
What would you say, Dolores, is this root cause? Because in this case, we had young people, showing up on another person's property, coming in intoxicated, could appear threatening, could appear. Is there conversation around Indigenous youth that no one wants to talk about here?
We know the history of our people as far as residential school is concerned. We know and we've lived the effects of it even more so now than it was years ago, because years ago the government and neither did our people want to acknowledge what happened. We knew it happened, but it just came more and more to light. When I think about my teen years and later finding out late in my life that my mom was a residential school survivor herself, something that my mom never talked to me about. And so when I saw the alcohol, the violence, and the neglect, just all of that growing up as a little girl, I could have very well walked down that road of, the thoughts are scary to me of what I could have been and who I could have turned out to be if it were not for God in my life. There was a lot of things that happened in the home behind those closed doors that have happened and still are happening to our young people today, because that ripple effect of residential school has been in our homes, and some very shameful things have happened. A lot of incest, a lot of molestations, and all that. And because of that, our young people don't know how to handle that. And so where do they vent out? They go into the drugs and the alcohol. We know that. So then when do then we say, how do we give them that hope? Because everything else around them is just not working for them.
So Lois, let me ask you, how do you see Jesus in the midst of the feelings of injustice of Colten Boushie, of Tina Fontaine? I mean, I think there's a lot of First Nations people in our country saying, where are you, Jesus? Mm-hmm. So how do you personally wrestle through that?
There's a story in the Bible, the story when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. There was a brother in the Lord that was sharing us this story, and he asked my husband, he says, how do you imagine Lazarus came out of that tomb? And my husband responded, he says, I imagine he hopped out. Lazarus represents our people. Our people have been wrapped up in this linen for so long that they have not been able to function as God has called them to live. Can you imagine what they saw when he was being unwrapped? Yeah, I'm sure there was a stink, but there was also probably some decay that was happening. And so as we unwrap our people, we're gonna smell some things that are not gonna smell so good. And that's going to be the stories that they're sharing even now, still today. But as we wrap, you're going to see some decay. And there has been some decay in our people. But I believe that as we unwrap, God will heal. That's the only way he's going to be able to do it, is we unwrap our people. God will be able to go in and heal our people. And that's the process that we're living in today. But the good news of it all is that God, being Jehovah Rapha, he is going to heal our people, and watch and see what God is going to do through our people when he heals them.
And we want to say a special thanks to the First Nations Church for helping us understand the Boushie story. We have left lots more of these voices today on our website in extended interviews. And we'll see you next week. Journey well together. I'm Lorna Dueck.
There's a hole inside this little human being, and they try to fill it with stuff. They don't know what it is, right? They put gambling in there, they put sex in there, they put money in there, they put drugs in there, they put all these little things that make them feel good for a little while or whatever the case might be, but they realize eventually that that's not what they're looking for. Because what they're looking for is their spirituality.
If, there's not a return to spirituality, do you think we're going to see more cases, more misunderstandings?
You're seeing them now. They're trying to fill something that's missing from inside of them, and I don't think they understand what that is that's missing.
I'm Lorna Dueck, and you're watching Context.
Voters turning their outrage into online worldwide trends.
Quebec has an interesting relationship with race and religion.
We'll never arrest our way out of this problem.
I guess the politics ahead of the people on the front lines is more concerning.
It's too dangerous for us to go over to Syria right now.
This is real, isn't it? We could be looking at another Rwanda.
God gave us this amazing place, and what we are doing to it is a sin.
Well, this is an issue our next guest is an expert on.
I think it's going to be very difficult for the province to follow these rules.
What is the standard that the church asks?
And he said, God's got you. You are protected.
How does that get decided, what the Pope will address? Joining me now is Wilma Dirksen.
What you're talking about here is the treatment of women in media and entertainment.
Bad behavior, is it out of control?
Join tonight's important discussion.